It was Election Day in Baltimore, October 3rd, 1849. Rain fell on the cobblestones outside a tavern called Gunner's Hall. Inside, men were voting. Outside, someone lay slumped against the wet brick. A man in a suit that did not fit him, barely conscious, wearing clothes that were not his own. A printer named Joseph Walker found him and sent for a doctor across town. Walker's note survives. There is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who appears in great distress and who is in need of immediate assistance. Ryan's polls and Gunner's Hall were the same building. 2 names for 1 address. Walker never claimed to know how the man got there. Hold on to that. Dr. Joseph Snodgrass came, and a carriage was arranged to Washington College Hospital. The man in the borrowed suit was Edgar Allan Poe. He was 40 years old. He had 4 days left, and he would never explain any of it to anyone. You've heard the ending already. He drank himself to death in a gutter. Here's the problem with that. No death certificate survives. No hospital record survives. No autopsy was ever performed. Almost everything anyone claims to know about his final days comes from a single doctor who told the story 3 times and contradicted himself every time. So this isn't the video that solves it. This is the video about what the evidence actually supports and where the confident version came from. Start with the 4 days in the hospital, because that's the only stretch of this story with a witness. The witness was Dr. John Moran, and Moran is the reason so little of this is settled. Moran published his account of the death 3 times. The first was a letter in 1849. The second was an 1875 pamphlet he called Official Memoranda. The third was a book in 1885. In the first, he admits Poe at 5 in the afternoon on October 3rd. In the second, on October 7th. In the third, October 6th. Same event, 3 different dates. By his earliest account, the one written closest to the event, Poe arrived unresponsive and then passed into a violent delirium. Moran said he sweated and trembled. He talked to things that weren't in the room. He couldn't say where he had been or how he came to be dressed the way he was. 4 days of that. Early on the morning of October 7th, 1849, it stopped. Moran's 1849 letter gives the last words as 5 of them. Lord, help my poor soul. 26 years later, Moran published a far longer version, full of buoys and lifeboats and ships of fire. Set that one aside. The earliest telling is the only one worth quoting. There's one more detail out of that room, and it has produced more theories than anything else in the case. Moran said Poe spent his final hours calling out a name, Reynolds. No other witness recorded it. Not a nurse, not a clergyman, not a relative. It exists in Moran's telling, and nowhere else, which is exactly the problem. Historians have offered candidates. One is Jeremiah Reynolds, an explorer and lecturer whose Antarctic writings shaped Poe's only novel. Another is Henry Reynolds, a Baltimore carpenter serving as an election judge at the 4th Ward polls, which would put him a few feet away on the day Poe was found. Both are educated guesses. In 1987, the Poe scholar William Bandy proposed something simpler. Poe may have been saying Herring. Henry Herring was a relative by marriage, a real man in Baltimore who turned up at the funeral. A dying man slurs a name. A doctor hears what he hears. That reading is entirely plausible, and it deflates the whole Reynolds mystery. The cause of death is thinner still. The Baltimore Clipper reported congestion of the brain. Later retellings attach the word phrenitis. Neither is a diagnosis in any modern sense. Both are period placeholders, the words a physician reached for when he didn't know or wouldn't say. A researcher went looking for the hospital records last century and found nothing. Now, go back 6 days and then back a little further. That summer, Poe was in Richmond and by most measures doing well. He was lecturing to full rooms. He was courting a widow he'd known as a teenager, Elmira Royster Shelton. And on August 27th, 1849, he joined the Sons of Temperance and publicly pledged sobriety. Newspapers in 4 cities carried the pledge within 3 weeks. Whether he kept it, nobody can verify. He'd made and broken such promises before. 5 weeks later, he left Richmond on September 27th, bound for Philadelphia, where a woman named Marguerite St. Leon Loud was paying him $100 to edit her poems. He had a plan and a paying job. He probably reached Baltimore on September 28th. Probably, because that date is worked backward from steamer schedules, not from anyone actually seeing him. And then nothing. No confirmed sighting for 6 days. No letter, no receipt, no landlord, no friend. Whether he ever reached Philadelphia Philadelphia at all has never been established either way. His own family couldn't fill the gap either. Nielsen Poe, a cousin who lived in Baltimore, wrote afterward that he could not determine where his cousin spent the time he was here or under what circumstances. That's a contemporaneous admission from a man with every reason to find out and every local advantage in doing it. So the mystery isn't why Poe was traveling. He told people exactly where he was going and why. The mystery is those 6 days and the one hard physical fact that came out of them. When he was found, he was wearing clothes that weren't his. His own clothing and belongings were never recovered or explained. That detail drives the leading theory, and the word for it is cooping. In Baltimore in the 1840s and 1850s, political gangs seized men off the street. They locked them in a back room or a cellar and poured liquor into them. Then they walked them from pole to vote again and again, changing their clothes between stops. Cooping isn't folklore. Period newspapers describe cops operating in Baltimore's 4th Ward in October 1849. Taverns doubled as polling places, and the free drinks were part of the design. The city earned the nickname Mob Town honestly. The practice is documented, and it was running in the exact ward where Poe was found in the exact week. Now look at the fit. It happened at a polling place on Election Day to a man found insensible in a stranger's ill-fitting suit and a battered straw hat, unable to account for himself. That is the entire evidentiary basis. Historians favor cooping because the circumstances line up, not because anyone ever documented it happening to him. And there's a serious objection to it. Poe was famous. Coopers wanted anonymous men, laborers and sailors, and new arrivals nobody would come looking for, not a nationally known writer. There's a sourcing problem too. The theory gathered force decades later, pushed by men who had first accepted a completely different explanation. That different explanation is the one everybody inherited: drink. Poe's difficulty with alcohol is real and well documented, including by people who liked him. He couldn't drink moderately. One glass could undo him for days. Nobody serious disputes that part of his life, and it belongs on the table as one live possibility. But look at who put it there. Snodgrass, the Dr. Walker summoned, spent the following years on the temperance lecture circuit, using Poe as his exhibit. He later described the man he found as beastly intoxicated. Walker's note says no such thing. It says a gentleman in great distress. The most quoted phrase in this case is an editorial addition. There's a medical objection as well. 4 days of fluctuating delirium is more than acute intoxication usually produces, and by Moran's account, there was no smell of drink on him at the hospital, though that's Moran again, so weigh it accordingly. Alcohol may well be part of this. It doesn't comfortably explain all of it. In 1996, a Maryland cardiologist named Michael Benitez was handed an anonymous case history at a clinical conference. An unnamed patient from 1849 with 4 days of delirium, fluctuating consciousness, and trouble drinking water. His diagnosis was rabies. Then he was told whose case it was, and the story traveled around the world as an answer. It isn't an answer. The water detail comes from Moran's 1875 account. Moran's 1885 account reverses it and says Poe drank half a glass without any trouble. There's no record of an animal bite. No remains have ever been tested, and the central symptom rests on the least reliable layer of an already unreliable source. The rest of the field is thin. There's a brain lesion from a diagnosis a physician supposedly made 2 years earlier. There's heart disease, epilepsy, meningitis. There's carbon monoxide from leaking coal gas, which is speculation with nothing behind it. And there's a book from 2000 arguing that his fiancée's brothers beat him, which Poe scholars have largely declined to accept. He was buried on October 8th in the family plot at Westminster in a service that lasted about 3 minutes with roughly 6 people present. Reverend William Clem officiated. It was a small and cold ending, and it might have stayed a local story if a rival of his in New York hadn't been reading the papers. 2 days after the death, the New York Tribune ran an obituary signed Ludwig. It opened by saying that few would be grieved. It described a man wandering the streets muttering, half mad. Ludwig was Rufus Griswold, an editor Poe had publicly mocked in print, and much of that obituary was lifted from a novel, not paraphrased, lifted. The lines came from the description of a fictional villain in a Bulwer-Lytton novel published that same year. Griswold then made himself Poe's literary executor, wrote a memoir studying stuffed with invented degeneracy and forged letters to support it. That portrait ran essentially unchallenged for the better part of a century. Which brings us to the thing worth noticing. The drunk in the gutter isn't a finding. It's a character, written by a man with a grudge, laid over an event that has no medical record at all, and then repeated until it felt like evidence. Subtract Griswold and Snodgrass, and the confident version of this story loses most of its sources. What actually survives is this. A man left Richmond with a destination and a paid commission. He vanished for 6 days. He turned up at a polling place on Election Day, incoherent, in clothes that weren't his own. He died 4 days later in a hospital that kept no record of him that anyone can find. Everything between those points is inference. There's no scholarly consensus today. Not on Cooping, not on drink, not on rabies. There won't be one either, because the evidence that could settle it was never created or didn't survive. Edgar Allan Poe spent a career writing men who die in ways nobody can quite account for. Then he went and did it himself.